Our guest is Jonathan Frutkin. He's the author of Equity Crowdfunding, Transforming Customers into Loyal Owners. And he's also the CEO of Crowdfunding. And what does Crowdfunding do?
Well, Crowdfunding is a consultancy, and the best way to describe it is half digital media firm and then half investment bank. But we also do investor relations also. So once people do a crowdfunding round, we also take care of their investors.
Okay, well, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about what's coming with crowdfunding. Some people are aware of it and eagerly anticipating it, like myself, and some maybe they haven't even really heard of it, or they think it's Indiegogo or Kickstarter.
Yeah, I mean, the last few years have really seen an emergence. After the internet was kind of a place where you'd go to read articles and it turned into a platform for social interaction. The last few years there's been a real transformation, and that's basically getting people together in order for a common cause. In the old days, if the Red Cross needed money, they'd send out an alert and people would give money to the Red Cross. Well, now people can gather up resources, whether it's money or volunteer time, online, and that's really what crowdsourcing is about. And crowdfunding is about taking the money and putting it to good use. And so that could be something like a Kickstarter or Indiegogo, a place where people get donations for their projects, whether it's a movie or an arts project or even a business. And that's slowly transforming into more of capital formation. In other words, raising money for your business in the form of selling part of your business for equity, or just borrowing money online from a whole bunch of people. And so it's pretty powerful way to raise money for a business, and it's really changing a lot of the way the internet's working.
And the equity side of this is just now coming to, not quite yet available, but just coming. Explain to us where things are right now with the law, and then we'll go back and figure out where it all came from.
Okay, well, as it stands right now, in 2012, a law was passed called the Jobs Act, and leave it to Congress. Jobs means Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. But really is more about business startups, but also established businesses, raising capital and changing the way that securities laws work so that it's easier to do it both online through crowdfunding, but it's also easier for companies to go public and some other things. So, of course, when you have a new law like this, a lot of the rules are left to regulatory agencies, in this case the SEC. And so the SEC is in the process of drafting the regulations, and slowly various parts of the Job Act are becoming effective. In other words, people can use them. Equity crowdfunding is not yet there. So we expect in the next few months we're going to see the regulations, and then early next year we'll be able to have it. So people are starting to think about it and talk about it, but you can't really do it yet in the way that we're going to talk about it today.
Yeah, and just in reading your book, I was struck with how you read so few books that say, earlier this year and by the end of this year. It's such a current item and book, and it's such flux right now. It was interesting to read a book that's actually more like a news report, like of what the status right now. So
yeah, it's definitely one of those things where we have a very good idea in the crowdfunding industry of what the SEC rules are going to look like. They have put some regulations in place. There's been some committee recommendations. There's been a lot of staff work. So we have a really good idea, but we're not 100% sure exactly what the rules will look like.
Okay. Well, and some of this is based on the historical, position of what the SEC was founded to do and stuff. So if we can go back to that, and just the reason why I can't just put an ad out on the internet and say, hey, give me money for my business and you can be an owner.
Well, we had a very kind of simple system until the early 1900s, and that is you were either rich and you could invest in companies, or you were poor. And the middle class, as that began to emerge, really didn't have those options. I mean, if they were going to invest in something that was their own home. And so what happened is at the beginning of the last century, in the early 1900s, people began to raise money really for oil and gas exploration, because as trains and cars and all that stuff came along, people wanted to raise money in order to drill these wells. And of course, we all know there's nothing like striking oil. So people began to raise money for these, and not surprisingly, a lot of them were fraudulent. And what happened was that the states began passing laws called blue sky laws. And blue sky, it basically says that if you look ahead and you see blue sky, that is transparency, then you're going to have a happy day. So that's where that comes from. And the blue sky laws started in the early 1900s. And what this meant was that each state had various laws in place. Of course, none of this really mattered too terribly much to the average person until the stock market crash in the late 20s. And what happened there was that some people actually got very, very wealthy during the stock market crash because there was no uniform system of reporting and giving information. And so most stock was traded on inside information. And, it's always easy to bet a baseball or basketball game when you know the star player is injured, right? And that's what was going on. And so a lot of people had little information, while few people had all the information. And so Congress acted in 1933 and 1934 and passed two different laws that created the SEC and pretty much put together all of the federal oversight for securities that we think of today. But remember, the SEC was founded basically at a time when there was very little information being shared for the sole purpose of sharing information, which I think we could agree is probably a pretty good thing, right?
Yeah. It's why we get those, huge piles of investor stuff that you could spend your entire life reading.
Right. Now, not surprisingly, right, over the last, we'll call it 80 years, what has happened is that the SEC has not created less regulation, they've created more. So no big surprise. That means those things get thicker and thicker. And the rules really haven't changed much at all since the early 80s. In the early 80s, they came out with Regulation D, which allowed people who were accredited investors to invest in private deals. And what accredited is supposed to mean is people who are sophisticated enough to know they'll lose their money, right? But what accredited really means is people who are rich. So if you have more than $1 million in net worth, not counting your house, or you've made more than $200,000 in the last 2 years, you're accredited. And so in the early 80s, the SEC said, look, we're not going to worry as much about accredited investors. You follow these rules. And most private capital in the U.S. is raised through Regulation D offerings, specifically something called a Rule 506 offering. And this is the type of thing where you get one of those big prospectuses, and if you are wealthy enough to qualify as an accredited investor, you could invest. Most of the investments, though, are pretty big, minimum units of 25,000, and it's a decent way to raise money for a lot of private businesses, but it's very limiting. And so this is the big change.
Well, generally you have to go through some angel investing group or VC firm.
Right. And the angel investors are almost always accredited investors, and then the ones that put their money in the pool are all accredited also. So, I mean, that's really your only option as far as raising money. And most of that comes from the early 80s. So this is the first big change in like 30 years.
So this new thing allows people who are not accredited investors to invest. And it also, I guess, what just happened recently was that they allowed you to advertise that you're selling shares in your company.
So the Jobs Act has various what we call titles. I don't know why they're called titles. They're called titles, but they're like they're like chapters in a book, right? And one of the chapters talks about whether or not you can generally solicit accredited investors. In the early 80s up till now, the accredited investors could not be solicited. That means you couldn't put an advertisement online. That meant that you couldn't tell people that we're raising money. You basically had to have a pre-existing relationship with them. And it made it very, very hard to raise money, but they were worried that companies who advertise well would basically fool people out of their money. The Jobs Act changed that. It basically says, look, if you are an accredited investor, you could handle the general solicitation. And so the SEC just finished the regulations, and those will be effective late in September. So we're getting there.
Okay, so it's still only for accredited investors.
Correct.
And in September, we should see a barrage of advertising.
Probably. And how exactly that works, is yet to be determined. But the one thing we know about the internet is it's real good at sharing information, right? And so to not have the ability to post the fact that you have an offering, up on the internet, it seemed kind of silly and like antiquated. And so this is going to change that. So you'll be able to, if you're a accredited investor, go onto various websites and see various deals and make the decision about where to invest your money. And that'll come very soon.
One of the things also I was struck by your book that you bring up a lot of stuff that seems to me like opportunities for ancillary businesses that will spring up that we haven't even seen yet. Just you mentioned that how the cashing business sprung up because people don't have bank accounts, and I'm thinking there's got to be other businesses that are just going to sort of suddenly be in need based on this on the the new opportunity.
Oh, for sure. And I think, yeah, our company is a good example of that. You didn't really need to worry if you were a small private company about dealing with a whole bunch of investors or certain aspects of social media or regulation. And so there'll be all sorts of people who pop up with all sorts of ideas that are probably better than mine in this space. And I've started to see some of those. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Let's jump ahead to the sort of the state of where things have been very recently with crowdfunding or crowd. I guess crowdfunding. I guess Kickstarter is crowdfunding.
It is. It is. So there's really three types of crowdfunding. The first is donation-based crowdfunding. That's the type of crowdfunding where you give money for a good cause. You don't expect anything in return. And so that would be the classic, Red Cross sort of appeal for money. The next is rewards-based crowdfunding. And that is where Indiegogo and Kickstarter and all these other sites have really found their niche. Basically what it is you invest money, and I use invest very liberally. You invest money, and in return for that, you get something. And so, for example, at the Veronica Mars movie, you might give $20 or $25, and in exchange for that, you get a digital copy of the movie when it comes out. Well, for $100, you might also get a signed script. If you give $1,000, you could be an extra, and for $5,000, you could be an executive producer. And so depending on how much you give, you might get enhanced rewards. And that's also been used for products. And so one really successful product is the Pebble watch. And basically the way that it worked is that you could give money, so it's $120, and you can get a watch once they came out, which is a $150 watch. And so products have had a good success on the rewards-based crowdfunding sites. Now, this doesn't mean you get money when the company does well. It just means you get whatever reward you signed up for, assuming that the film gets made or the watches get shipped. And so that's really the limitation on your return. But they've been very successful. A lot of money has been raised. Kickstarter, for example, raised more money for arts projects last year than the National Endowment of the Arts gave out as grants. And so it's a stunning success story, and it really is, I think, for a lot of people who are in artistic endeavors, really kind of the future. People will be able to decide what arts projects to fund as a group rather than depending on a government body or, an endowment. People really get to decide and direct arts projects.
Yeah, my brother successfully raised money for he produces plays.
There's a lot of advantages to it too for someone in that sort of situation. You get a lot of people following your progress. You're going to have hopefully a successful opening because people feel invested in your project. There's a lot of big advantages to it, which kind of leads to the area where I wrote about, which is equity crowdfunding. That is, you give money, and in exchange you become an owner. And so for a lot of people, I think that's pretty exciting, and eventually I think that is going to be a major part of everyone's kind of life. It'll be what did you invest in? Because right now, you invest in some mutual fund in your retirement account or maybe Exxon, nothing that you really care about, right? And so that's going to really change things a lot when you could start owning local businesses that you care about.
Right, and it's that evangelism, I think, that I don't think I initially got when I first heard about equity crowdfunding. I thought, as an entrepreneur, I think, great, now I can raise money for my business, on the internet, and this will be a good way to, grow my business and access to capital without completely tying myself down to like a small business loan.
I think that a lot of people think about crowdfunding that way, and I might be I guess, in a very, very small minority in the crowdfunding community when I say this. I think that in general, equity crowdfunding is a really lousy way to raise money. It's hard. It's a lot of work. You got to get a little bit of money from a lot of people. There's a lot of regulations. And then after you're done, you've got a lot of people who own your business with you. And they're going to feel entitled. And it's not the best way to raise money, but as a marketing opportunity, as a way to grow your business, as a way to become really, to have your customer base become a lot more than just customers. It's an unparalleled opportunity. And so for those that think that equity crowdfunding might be a great place to raise money, I don't know. But when people start to think about it as a way to just completely transform their marketing strategy, it's a huge opportunity.
Yeah, people who are part of an owner of a business are going to promote it to, and also you mentioned contributing, maybe actually some skills to the business as well, which certainly we look for in venture capital, right?
Sure. And I mean, there's really three things that we say that transforming just a customer into an owner does. The first is their spend. That is, they spend more money at the business. And that's because both because they have a small ownership percentage, so they'll receive some of that returned as a dividend. But it's also an ease for which people spend money at their own business where they might not spend it at just the business down the street. The next is frequency. So people tend to go more often to businesses where they have an ownership interest, and whether that's a local restaurant or even something like getting their air conditioner, checked every year instead of waiting for a major breakdown if they own the air conditioner company. We see people going more frequently. But you're right. The number three reason why crowdfunding is such a great opportunity is the evangelicalism. It's the fact that people are really going to spend a lot of time promoting the business. And the one spot that I don't think people think about quite enough is not only are you likely to get that great Yelp review from somebody who's an owner rather than just a customer, but you're a lot less likely to get the bad Yelp review. That is, when something goes wrong, an owner of the business is much more likely to pull aside a manager and try to correct the situation rather than tell everyone about the bad experience. And that is a huge thing for a lot of consumer-facing businesses. Basically, an opportunity to fix problems before it goes viral, right? And owners, they'll be a lot less likely to put the bad word out.
Yeah, no, I've been a supporter of small business for a long time. So whenever I do go somewhere and there's something not right, I always make sure that sometimes I hate to mention it, but I do want to pull over the owner and say, hey, look, this is my experience, and you should know. And I do that, and sometimes they don't take kindly to it. But truthfully, I'm doing them a favor by telling them, hey, you should know about this before somebody else, squeals about it.
Yeah, most small business owners, I think, are responsive to that. They really do like the fact that you're making sure that they're successful in their business. And quite frankly, I mean, it's sometimes how you approach them. But at the core, that is the key to a successful small business, right? It's having customers who care enough about your business to pull you aside and give you a little bit of advice, right? and so that is an advantage that you get with equity crowdfunding.
You had mentioned the regulation. So this is not going to be, this equity crowdfunding is not going to be like Kickstarter. Just click, fill out a form, boom, you're on your way, right? It's much more complicated than that. It's going to be.
It's a little bit complicated because, of course, with Kickstarter, because you don't have the SEC involved, you just fill out a form and it's no big deal. For crowdfunding, we actually had to create an entirely new business called a funding portal. Before the Jobs Act, there was basically one of two ways to buy stock in a company. One is directly from a company, and the second is through a registered broker-dealer. And a registered broker-dealer has all sorts of oversight responsibility, due diligence responsibility, and quite frankly, you can understand why. Like the SEC wants to have somebody vet out these opportunities rather than just promote them, and that's what a broker-dealer does. Well, because of the amounts of money that are going to be raised is going to be considerably smaller than the average deal of $1, $5, $10 million that you see in the traditional private space. They needed to set up something that had a lot less regulation, but some, and that was a funding portal. And so you're going to see websites that are registered funding portals that are going to be the places where you are going to be able to get a crowdfunded deal. This means that someone can't just walk off the street and start the next Kickstarter or start the next Indiegogo. They have to go through that process. So that's a big difference.
But as a small business, I'm not just going to be able to go to this funding portal and say, "Hey, I want to offer 50% of my company up for sale," and there's going to be a lot of paperwork, I imagine, for me as a small business to go do that.
There's definitely a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of disclosure requirements, and it's the sort of thing where whether it's the funding portal or a company like ours, you're going to have to work with people to tell you exactly how to do it, because it's not going to be that simple. It's definitely an eye-opener for most businesses when they first do their first bank loan. They're like, this is so much paperwork, Multiply that by about 5 or 10, and then you're in the right area for crowd. Yeah, I mean, part of it is just as simple as getting your house in order, and that's something that a lot of small businesses don't really care much about, right? You have a business partner and kind of shake on it. It's usually fine. But when you get into crowdfunding, you need to have everything kind of T's crossed and I's dotted. Then, after all that's done, you have to make sure you make the legally required disclosures. And the funding portal is required to make sure you have those before your campaign goes live. So there is a lot of work to be done on kind of the nuts and bolts of it. But that's frankly why companies like ours are around, right, to help businesses through that.
I know I started this business, this current business, the Small Business File Inc., with the idea that equity crowdfunding is coming. I'm not sure if it'll be appropriate for me, but I didn't want to not be ready, so I actually formed a C Corp, and I assumed that was the right thing to do. I don't know if LLCs are going to be able to take advantage of this, or if
Well, it's funny. My background is I'm an attorney. It's funny, all these crowdfunding people are all lawyers. But what I think that will likely happen is that LLCs will generally be used. There will be an investing LLC where the crowdfunding investors will invest, which will then invest in the business. I think that you'll see different tax treatments chosen for the different LLCs. But there is a lot of discussion in the legal community about the best way to do this. And I guess we'll see over the next 6 months or so whether I'm right or wrong. For a lot of small businesses, obviously, electing a straight C status creates double taxation and is very disadvantageous. So I think that we will see some creative structures which will then become standardized in the crowdfunding space, so that you'll see most deals look pretty similar eventually. I don't know if I'm right. I'm right about a lot of things for sure, but I don't know if I'm right about this particular area about what it'll look like. But I think you'll see a standardization, because crowdfunding investors will be way too confused if we do it too many different ways, right?
Right. So are there things that people who are looking towards crowdfunding should be doing now to get their houses in order to be ready for this, or things that they should be thinking about, or is it still too early? We should take a wait and see approach.
Everybody's got to do a couple things. I mean, one is kind of this discussion about getting your legal house in order. But the second and most important thing is, because crowdfunding is inherently a social network-driven process, and that's not just your online social network, that's your real-life social network. You need to really focus on that and understand that 90% of the money that is raised or will be raised is going to be from people who you have a direct connection to, or people who have a direct connection to those people that you have a direct connection to. We call them your first or second spheres. And there's a lot of people who think in their mind crowdfunding will mean a bunch of people from all around the world will invest in your business. It's just not true. You have to do your own work. And so right now is the perfect time to really focus on your social media strategy. Make sure that you are really developing out a robust social network. And if you do that, then you will have a good chance of actually being able to have a successful campaign. If you don't do that and you just think you can throw it up online, those will be the unsuccessful ones.
And do you want to start talking about your business within the social sphere, about our business is growing, or we have plans to do this, or should it just be the usual social, putting out a blog about the topic that your business is known for? Yeah.
I think that you have kind of two sets of things going on. One is really focusing on exactly what you should be focusing on with social media, right? Getting the blogs out, getting connections to people. And the second thing, though, is really focusing on what sort of, I guess, brand you're developing. And for a lot of businesses, they really don't focus on that in their social media. They think of that as maybe their logo, or once you walk into the establishment, what it's like. And so really making sure your brand identity is being pulled through to your social media strategy is really important. And I mean, I think that the people who do that successfully are going to be successful anyway. It's not just for crowdfunding.
So what are the downsides, or what are some of the things that people should consider before they get all excited about crowdfunding? Why would somebody not want to go that route?
Well, there's two things. I mean, one is that it's a relatively expensive process, and I don't mean that just really in terms of dollars. I mean, companies like ours, for example, we tend to make our money, when you close a round of funding, so it's not really that much of an out-of-pocket expense. But you do have a legal expense. There are audit requirements if you are raising more than $500,000 for small companies. That is often a shock that they have to do that. And so there are upfront expenses. But the real upfront expense is your time. As an owner of a business, you have a lot of things that you need to do. And one of those things is going to be raising money, and the equity crowdfunding in the long run will pay off for you, because you're going to be taking your customers and making them so much more. But at the time that you are doing it, you're going to spend an awful lot of time focused on it. And so in terms of resources, it's not just cash, it's time.
Right. Well, there's investor relations as well, right?
Yeah. So the second part is what we affectionately call the day after. So what happens the day after? You get the money and you wake up and you got 600 or 800 people who are investors, and you don't want those people showing up at your business and talking to the person at the front desk about being an owner, right? And so companies like ours are out there in order to support those companies and basically act as what I call a concierge for the business. And so for the owners, we provide those services. And obviously we do all the things like cutting the dividend checks and doing the investor communications. But it's also about more than that. It's about treating these people like they're owners rather than just customers anymore.
And so would a company like yours then provide advice about how much to offer as a dividend, or that kind of financial advice?
We do. We give some valuation advice at the front end, and then an ongoing conversation about what a fair return is. Remember that there's only one thing better than being an owner, and that's being an owner with a check in your hand. And so I write about that in the book and talk a little bit about how REI, which is a large, sporting goods company. It's a co-op, and they return dividend checks at the end of the year. And they see a surge in sales in the first few months of the year when most retailers aren't doing well at all.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I thought it was I didn't realize that REI operated that way, not being an outdoorsman myself.
I'm a fake outdoorsman. I like to say that I'm going to start any day now. But the fact is that REI has been extremely successful, not just because of the fact that as a co-op, people feel an ownership interest, but because they do write that check every year, and it comes right with the catalog. So.
Right, and I guess that they have to, if they it's in the form of store credit or something, right? Or they can cash it in. That's right. You said in the book.
For the first 6 months, you can use it as store credit, and then you can use it as cash. And so a lot of people do use it as store credit. A lot of people, don't use it at all. They never cash the check. But the act of sending the check is very important. And so we encourage our clients to really focus on making sure that they're getting a fair return to their investors, because the secondary market is not going to be exactly as robust as like selling a public stock, right? So for an owner, they're oftentimes going to be locked in.
That you bring me to another thing that I almost forgot to mention, and that is, as entrepreneurs, I think, we think crowdfunding, we get excited about the idea we can raise money for our business. We also get excited about the idea of creating evangelists, but we don't think about the exit strategy for the investor, right? How are they going to get the cash out of it other than dividend? I mean, there's dividends. And I don't think a lot of us even think of that because we're so used to like, oh, well, we just scrape the profit off and that's ours, right? But if you have investors, you have to make that a pool. But talk about the exit strategies for investors.
So the SEC has looked at this, and there is been a recommendation from a committee that the secondary market that basically be limited for companies that raise money through Title III, which is the crowdfunding exemption. That those shares can be transferred in a secondary market, but only to accredited investors. What that means is basically you're going to have a relatively illiquid market, most likely for secondary shares. I'll tell you what we tell our clients, though. We tell our clients that you need to have, in order to work with us, you need to have a redemption policy, which basically allows a certain number of shares every year to be cashed out. And so if you're an investor and you want to be cashed out, you can get your name added to the list. If you're, amongst the first group, you get cashed out this year. And if you aren't part of that, you get cashed out the following year. And then we standardize valuation metrics. And so a lot of us in the industry are thinking about it. I think it's critical that there's some strategy in place because I'll tell you, the only thing worse than taking someone who's just a customer and making him into an owner who's nosy is making him into an angry owner who's nosy. So you don't want that. So we require that of the companies that we work with, that they have a redemption policy. So we'll see how the industry shakes out, but for the companies we work with, there's always a way for the investor to get their money out.
So it's not going to be a secondary stock market kind of thing?
There will be a secondary stock market, kind of. And based on what the SEC has voted out of committee, the advisory committee says that will be limited to accredited investors. I think that will make the market less than robust, but we'll see. I mean, you're basically saying only some people can participate in the secondary market as buyers, but everybody can participate as a seller. So your pricing will probably be, it will be a disadvantage to the kind of normal off-the-street investor, and it'll be advantageous for an accredited investor because they could buy secondary stock for cheaper.
So when this first starts out, what effect do you think it's going to have on the regular stock market? Whereas suddenly there's this alternative market that people can put their money into. How much money do you think it'll drain from the regular stock market?
I think it will overall increase the amount of capital in the regular stock market also. I'll tell you why. The number of people who invest in the regular stock market is at the highest level in the United States that it's ever been. And that really has to do with 401k plans and some other things like that. But it used to be a generation ago that well under half the people in the U.S. had money in the stock market. So it's slowly increasing, and it's the highest level it's ever been. Unaccredited investors, based on the way the Jobs Act is written, can invest a total of $2,000 a year in crowdfunded funding opportunities. And so it's a relatively small amount of money. But it's going to take a bunch of people who aren't used to investing and show them that they should invest. And those people will invest extra money, I think, into regular stock market offerings. As this goes global, that's where we'll really see the money being driven into the U.S. stock market, I think. That is, people will begin to learn investing behavior, which is, quite frankly, something that over generations, is slowly taught. You're usually taught you keep money in a rainy day fund, right? You keep it under the mattress if you think through the year. But you invest money in the stock market is a relatively new phenomenon. And as that grows globally, more and more capital will be pushed toward U.S. stock markets. And so I think the effect of crowdfunding is going to be an increase in the overall capitalization of public companies.
Okay. Which brings me to the other thing, in terms of globalization. Just because the U.S. is doing this crowdfunding thing now, it's been done elsewhere before. And what has happened there? I mean, what other industries that have sprung up, or what's been the impact on business in those countries?
It is, in the world of equity crowdfunding, it is still very new. We see a lot of platforms around the world, including in the U.S., that focus on accredited investors. We see good returns. We see really kind of an exciting opportunity for people in the higher income brackets in order to make investment. But as far as local businesses being funded, we're still at the very early stage. We do see it. Italy, UK, France all have crowdfunding, as well as South America, and we're slowly seeing that emerge. Where the big spike has actually been in the crowdfunding in the lending area, and so people have borrowed enormous amounts of money online. And that is being done through a crowdsourced model where somebody might borrow $25,000, but that's 1,000 people, each lending them $25. And that we've seen a huge increase.
I know there's Kiva, which made a lot of news, but it always seemed like you had to be in a third world country or something like that, and trying to fund a business with $100 or something.
There's two platforms in the U.S. that have really emerged. And one is called Prosper, and the other is called Lending Club. And Lending Club is the one that's really accelerated their growth, and they are going to do probably $2 billion in lending this year. It's an enormous amount of money. Their model is basically to provide a platform for people to borrow money, whether that's for a business, to fix their house, for medical expenses, and borrow that money from the crowd. And the way that those businesses work is basically it creates a credit profile, rates the borrower, and that makes what your interest rate is. And so the crowd is able to select whatever investment lending opportunities they want, and based on the credit risk, based on the interest rate. And as those people repay their loans, Lending Club distributes the money to the various crowdfunding investors. And of course, in return, they keep 1%, which turns out to be a lot of money, by the way. Those businesses have done really well. There's a lot of institutional money that thinks that there's a great opportunity in the crowd funding area too, because they think the default rates will be lower on loans that are made by the crowd than those that are made by banks or by big lending institutions. There's kind of a perception that people are more likely to pay back people rather than pay back banks. And I think probably that will turn out to be true. But that's a reason also that you've seen an acceleration of the amount of investment that have gone into these what are called peer-to-peer lending sites.
And for the business owner, is the process of applying for those kind of loans easier or the same as going through a bank?
It's much easier. The interest rates are usually not as favorable. They're a little bit higher. The big advantage is that you're able to get money together relatively quickly, and you are usually relying on your own credit. So, if things go badly, then you're on the hook personally. Of course, that's true of bank loans too. I argue in the book and generally that for a business owner, if they have a consumer-facing business where they have a lot of customers, that having your customer base lend you money is nowhere near as powerful as having your customer base become owners. And so that's why I'm so excited about the equity space. But when you're just talking about pure dollars and pure growth, that lending space is done real well very, very quickly.
Yeah, and especially in a market where the bank lending is just all but dried up for small businesses. So, there's not a lot of other options sometimes.
That's true. And so that's a really good place, I think, for people who have, we just call them micro small businesses, 0 to 10 employees type of people who, are probably more likely to watch this. For those people, this is a real good spot to just kind of take a look and think about whether this is useful for their financial needs, capital needs.
And are the terms on those pretty much the same as a bank? You loan it and you start paying immediately a percentage, or?
Generally speaking, the Lending Club model is either 36-month or 60-month repayment terms. And based on your credit rating, I believe that the interest rates go from like 5 or 6% up to 24%. It's based on your credit history.
What opportunities do you see in the service in the area for servicing the equity crowdfunding business? What do what sorts of businesses do you envision popping up around this?
Well, there'll be a few like ours, right, that provide services. There'll obviously be funding portals, and those are the places where you raise money. And then you're going to see, I think, a kind of host of other companies that that are doing things. You'll see some media companies. You'll see analysts. In the law, the funding portals aren't allowed to rate the deals.
So like a Yelp for this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean you'll have outside analysts, and we obviously depend on people we think that are good prognosticators in everything else we do. It won't be a surprise that we have a bunch of companies that emerge as prognosticators, and I think that you'll also see an increase in kind of the services that you anticipate, accounting and lawyers and PR people and digital media firms that might exist now that really focus on this area. So I think that there'll be some brand new businesses. I'll give you one example. There's a business called CrowdCheck, and there's a due diligence phase that the funding portals have to go through to make sure that there's no criminal histories and some other things of the owners. There's just a bunch of stuff you got to do. This company, CrowdCheck, they basically do the due diligence. And so you hire them if you're a funding portal, and they go out and they validate everything. And as a third-party validation service that had no reason to exist before this, they've established themselves really as the leader in an industry that's just being created. So there's a bunch of companies like CrowdCheck that are finding space that we didn't really have use for before.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll have to see. I'll have to check them out and probably put a link to it on the site so people can check it out further. Really want to thank you for being on the show.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you having me. You know, if people want to go to the Crowdfunding website, for now that's where my blog is hosted, and we'll always have a link to my blog, and that'll let them kind of think maybe about how equity crowdfunding might help their business, or the way that as investors or members of the community, the way that maybe in the future it'll shape the way that they participate in their local business community.
Terrific. Our guest has been Jonathan Frutkin, the author of Equity Crowdfunding, Transforming Customers into Loyal Owners. All the links we've mentioned, including the link to his website and the book, can be found at the bottom of this page.